Okay, let's start on the African stuff. But first, just as a note, if you've been listening, of course, if you don't, so you can help it, to the news in the last couple of weeks, that whole word infrastructure that we've been talking about all semester long has obviously come up center to this whole sort of panic or reaction to the various types of COVID-19 crises. Not least which is the total lack of preparation, at least in the United States, for preparing medical protection, whether it be masks or other types of devices. Given the fact that you have to remember this is occurring originally in China in November, it's becoming a common discussion point in December. By January, it was already pretty obviously pretty much out of control, and they're shutting areas down. There was no attempt in the part of the United States or many other countries to do anything to prepare, to make any sort of assumption it was going to expand into their area, literally until it arrives, which is why you end up with these sort of, hate to say it, but silly situation where you've got very little in the way of protective gear for medical personnel, even the toilet paper and hand sanitizer. No attempt to prepare that, and that's again this whole issue of infrastructure. When you think about it, infrastructure is all the systems that you've got in place to deal with things, whether they be normal things, but most importantly, the abnormal things, whether it be flood control systems. So when bad floods occur, you're already prepared for it. Or in this case, basically a disease parameter that, again, you have to remember, you have SARS back in roughly, 20 years ago. You have whatever the Ebola situation was they thought was going to be a case, I think, about 8 or 10 years ago. And anyone in the business will point out to you that pandemics are a given. The most frightening, of course, if you go back to the 1918 Spanish flu outbreak. So, not preparing for something like that, assuming that it's going to stay in one place and not go into another, is sort of criminally naive. But that also, again, gives the issue that, populations and governments tend to deal with the minimal amount that's necessary and assume that norm is going to persist. And when the abnormal happens, is they're sort of woefully unprepared for it. And the other part of this is not only the issue of infrastructure, but also this issue of sort of national identity, the us versus them. They keep it out of our area, keep it out of our borders, keep it out of our region, that you blame it on each other. The current dialogue going in the United States of blaming China for the pandemic. I mean, the Chinese didn't make it. They just were the first people to catch it. So, it's part of this very sort of chilling reality of the 21st century that in some ways we really haven't progressed much in 100 years in terms of our sense of regionality and the fact that the planet is a single system and all of it's sort of part of a single system. So I think this whole infrastructure discussion we've had all semester long really pops up here, and it's really going to pop up when we hit the Sub-Saharan Africa region, because this is an area that, for a whole mess of reasons, some physical, some political, some social, just really hasn't gained traction in most of this region much in the 20th, at least in the late 20th, early 21st century. And right now they're poised to be basically the sort of nightmare location for COVID-19 when it hits, because you have basically in many areas no infrastructure in place, which means that whatever you want to do, it's a moot point, because whatever the pandemic wants to do, it can just move freely through the population. So we'll see how that plays out. But just sort of keep that in mind when you're looking at this whole region. So, okay, when we look at here, I'm hoping this is going to switch. Okay, so. Okay, I'm going to use Google Maps because I can't figure out how to port Google Earth over to this easily. So if we look at Google Maps, and here we see, Africa, the continent of Africa, which will include Madagascar. Just as a note, I'm sure you're going to shed tears, but I'm not going to have map quizzes for the rest of the semester, because by the time I figure out how to do it, the semester will have passed, and I'm sure that you're just totally gutted by that, but you'll just have to survive not taking your map test. Having said that, you do have the blank one, so if you want to do it on your own, feel free. So if we look at the Africa part, you remember we already did part of Africa, this northern part here. we already covered, because to the European sensibilities, this was part of what they called sort of West Asia, North Africa. So they saw this as being distinctively different from everything further south. And this is, even till today, this really sort of shapes Euro-American mentalities of Africa. Many Americans, given the fact they have abysmal geography in the first place, it never dawns on them that Egypt's in Africa. They somehow think Egypt is sort of like, I don't know, out there somewhere. And so when someone says, oh, Egypt is near the Central African Republic, or Cameroon, they sort of like, not really. So, looking at this, it's important to remember, on one hand, you have this physical phenomenon. On the other hand, it's important to remember that perception and attitude has a huge impact on this. Not surprisingly, one of the side effects is tourism in this northern region is a major industry. People going to see the pyramids, people going to see the abandoned Roman cities in Libya, etc. People going to Morocco. I mean, this is a big part of, well, it was a couple months ago, a big part of tourism globally. Also, to a certain extent, lesser extent, but also large extent, going to South Africa or Botswana to experience, your Sub-Saharan savanna, zebra, et cetera, animal populations. Having said that, if you notice, there's this huge chunk in between, which is sort of like completely out of the discussion. And this becomes sort of the stereotypic Africa, this is like a bad organ in the background, and the idea of jungles and weird shit going on, and just sort of, a really gnarly part of the planet. And that's the stereotype. Now, if you remember, we saw a little bit of that when we were talking about the Western Pacific and Melanesia, because Melanesia was seen in some ways as being part of Africa, or something very similar. So, in fact, for much of the 19th, in fact, I think related to maybe the last part of the 20th century, this whole central region of Africa was often kind of called Darkest Africa. And, I have no idea where that comes from. Undoubtedly, it has to do with these, the stereotypic skin tint of the population. But it also had to do with the fact that no one knew much about the place. There was an area where weird stuff went on. A lot of this was not mapped. Big parts of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, still haven't been mapped in 2020. So large parts of this part of the world really haven't been mapped. So it was sort of like a mystery part of the planet, like a big question mark, what's out there, who knows, and rivers that have never been discovered, and places that have never been seen. The whole sort of bad romantic, goofy sort of, survivor type movie thing. If you actually look at the place physically, you can sort of get a sense of this whole area is basically like a worn out slipper. Like Australia, this is the other oldest piece of real estate on the planet that's still exposed. So if you want to think of it, it's basically all the high spots have been pretty much worn down. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see this a little bit. Just about your only mountain range, your only mountain system is over here. And that's actually a fairly recent volcanic rift where basically part of the plate actually cracked and materials come up. But the rest of this whole area, if you look at it, there's really not a lot going on. That whole area is pretty seriously flat. This has a whole set of implications in a whole mess of ways. Not the least of which is, since it doesn't have a lot of elevation, because it is fairly flat, when you end up with your winds and moving across this part of the world, there's nothing to stop them and make them drop rain. If you think of this in contrast, for example, to Pali. You go over Kaneohe side in the morning, the winds, the trades are blowing the winds in, they stack up against the Pali and they drop water because of the elevation. You don't have that happening in here. So what that means is, on one hand, this place gets monsoon rains, but on the other hand, there's very little in the way of regional water movement. It's not very predictable. And when you do get rains, you end up with a situation like this. Let's see. It doesn't show up very well. But here we go. If you look at this river here, there's almost no elevation change in it. Now, what that means is it's sort of like if you live in Baratania Street in Macaulay, Moe, when it rains, the water just sits there because there's no elevation to make the water go somewhere else. And this is one of the huge problems in Africa in general. Here we go, it's a classic example here. Is that you've got these massive river systems, but they tend to be fairly shallow. They don't tend to move a lot of water a lot of distance. And you can imagine, for example, if you look at all these different webs that are part of the Congo, in this particular area around Ibonda, then imagine trying to put a bridge across that. How do you get roads on this side of the river to hook up to roads on this side of the river, like this road that ends right here? Imagine the cost that you'd have, because on most, this is almost entirely swamp. It's all the same elevation. So, you know, how high that bridge would have to be, or bridges, you know, how are you going to design it? What happens when it does finally flood and rain? This whole area basically turns into a puddle. So you've got these massive areas of rivers that are moving very, very slowly. And basically it's largely, you know, almost no movement at all. If you just Google the Congo and look at images of the river, it's just, it looks like a big brown pond. All the water, because there's very little elevation change, there's no movement, means these are very shallow, which means, among other things, you can't run boats up in much of this area. You not only can't run boats, you couldn't use seaplanes, you really can't get around, you're just pretty much stuck. In many cases, what you'll have is maybe a ferry will go across, but even a ferry is going to have an incredibly difficult time, because how do you, you know, where's the water, how do you get to it, how do you get to the other spot? So notice how this river acts as this enormous barrier. If you look at these roads, just all come to a screeching halt. It make a hell of a lot of sense to have them connected here, but they can't. And that's because where this river is this year might not be where it's going to be in 6 months. So you can see all the different courses it's following at the same time. And of course, it could move over here equally easily. So when you look at these, this is very typical of what you see in Sub-Saharan Africa, is your river systems are enormously problematic. They're like the last thing you want to have to deal with. And you just visualize for a second, here you've got, you know, you're on the equator, so you've got, you know, 80, 90, 100-degree weather, high humidities, very little wind, and you've got a still river. You know, so this isn't exactly, you're not going to get a lot of tourists going and hanging out here because they want to have a good time and bond with nature. This is going to be a place that people are going to go like, oh no, you know, why do I have to go here? What do we have to do here? So, you know, you can just see, just go ahead and enter down this river. Roads stop, roads stop. So this river basically is an isolation point. And this is very typical of all this region of Africa. It tends to be very, very flat, relatively speaking. There's little elevation change, there's little water movement. And so what it means is this whole area is just sort of stuck. Now, having said that, like Australia, because it is so old in terms of geology, there's an enormous amount of mineral resources in this entire region, especially in this area here. But of course, just like when we looked at Russia, what you've got is you might have a ton of copper and gold and all sorts of other stuff up here, for example. But how the hell are you going to get to it? You know, how are you going to build a road there? How do you even dig a pit in the ground when the ground is basically waterlogged and it's raining a lot of the time and it's still standing stagnant water a lot of the time? You know, imagine being the guy that's got to figure out as an engineer, oh, we're going to put a mine right here. So when you look at this particular part of the world, there's an enormous number of problems that are related to the physical nature of it. Now, as I mentioned, I think when we were talking about North Africa, when you look here, you've got this really striking phenomenon. Notice this green line right here. And what you're looking at is the fact that about 1,500 years ago, I don't know, you have to look somewhere, I'm not sure we've moved that. What you had, as I think I mentioned with this region, is you had a change in the jet stream. These are the high level, 20, 35,000, 40,000 foot elevation winds that move around the planet like giant sort of rivers. So actually jet rivers would be more sensitive to jet streams. And they're moving fairly quickly. If you're flying to the mainland and flying back, you might end up with a 20 to 40 mile an hour tailwind or headwind. So these are moving quite quickly, and they move huge amounts of moisture, both directly, but also by pulling the air or the land air masses underneath them. And so traditionally what you had in this part of the world was the southern equatorial jet stream, or the equatorial jet stream moved sort of like this. It moved across here, swept across here, then swung back up this way. Now, for some reason, entirely related to just, you know, nature being nature, around 400 AD, it decided to swing up here. So it swung up here, basically shifted north about 200-300 miles. And the end result is this whole area just dried out literally, you know, probably in 50 years. And the end result is what you see here. So what you get in this region, if you think of the area just to the south, but still relatively flat, but it's this absolutely brutal, brutal landscape that almost entirely is what we call stony desert. It's just stunningly harsh. It's incredibly difficult to get across. This was the famous Paris to Dakar rally, was sending cars as fast as they could across this thing. And I think on average, maybe 20% of the cars made it. The other percent crashed or broke. You know, getting across this area is just almost impossible. You've got one or two roads. I think this is the main one that goes all the way from north to south. But you can imagine, you know, driving across this thing, you better make sure that your tires don't blow out. You better make sure you've got enough gas, and you sure as hell better make sure you've got water. Because, oh, sorry, that's a national border. Because if you don't, you're just, you know, you're flat out of luck. So this is what we call the Great Stony Desert. Now, this is much larger than it was 2,000 years ago because of these jet stream changes. In fact, you can see we've got an old river here that's dried up. And now basically all you've got is just dirt. And in many cases, the dirt is completely blown away, and all you've actually got is rock. You've got stones and rocks. So if you've ever been to Kaho'olawe, it's got the same surface that you've got at Kaho'olawe. All the light material has been blown away to some other part of the planet. And what you've got is sort of a sandblasted leftover piece of real estate. And this is this part of Africa. So if you visualize the countries that are caught betwixt and between these, now imagine, what do you do with that? If you're Mali, for example, the vast majority of your country is stony desert. And here's one of your slow-moving rivers. So you've got a little bit of irrigation along the river, because that's got the Niger as your main water course. But it's also the way you get around, but it's not easy to get around because, like the other rivers, it's very, very flat in here. So you can see again, notice how the river goes like all over the place. So getting across it's almost impossible. Notice how the road goes north to stay on the other side of it. And then wham, you're back in the desert again. And remember, this isn't like a camel type desert. This is rocks. This is rocks, bigger rocks and really big rocks, and plateaus. So it's basically almost nothing. And boom, that's the end of the country. So what you've got is you've got countries that either are in rainforest, like Burkina Faso, or the northern part of Burkina Faso is in the stony desert. So what you don't have is, because you're not in the what you might call more benign areas till you get down into here, that these two environments really dominate a lot of the African landscape. Now, what this meant is not so much for the populations that live here, because people lived here, you know, this is where the human species starts. People have been here for millions of years in one way, shape, or form. But in the 1700s, when the Europeans are sailing around the world and trying to figure out what to do with spots, they're going to look at this area and they're going to go like, yeah, okay, whatever's. So this area basically becomes, you know, a bad idea. The Europeans are not going to spend a lot of time colonizing it. They're not going to spend a lot of time exploring it. They're not going to spend a lot of time investing time and energy in it. And so what you find is, in a weird situation, is this is some of the last areas in the planets that the Europeans turned into colonies, which, you know, in some ways might be good, since colonies aren't necessarily a good idea. But it also says something about the fact that the Europeans thought the area had so little value that it wasn't worth the trouble of actually making them into colonies. And many of these areas, even when they were colonies, didn't actually have maps. You didn't have maps of Cameroon, for example. The French had not only they knew this was Cameroon, but they never did any maps of the border. So you weren't really sure where the Central African Republic, which I think was British, and Cameroon, which is a French colony, no one actually knew where this line was, except at a couple of spots. So it's like, yeah, I don't know, you know, you sort of go up in here, this is our side, that's your side. But it says something that you're not even going to spend the time and effort to figure out where your colony is, because you just don't want to waste any money. So like the Pacific, but even more so, this is a part of the world that the Europeans treat very casually. It's not part of the world they really see as compellingly useful, with a few exceptions. And as we'll see, the few exceptions would be down here in the south. Of course, this becomes the infamous or famous case of South Africa. Okay, let's switch back here. Oh yeah, you know, the side point is when you have tropical environments, and we're a good example, we're subtropical, you end up with very thin soils. So you do not have something like the bush you have in China. You have very little in the way of soil, which means you have very little in the way of potential good agricultural land, which means it's even harder for a human population to really sort of expand its population base. And in the modern context, it's very hard to grow things, for example, that people want to buy and people want to eat. It's not by accident this part of the world tends to be really famous for, you know, for starvation and various, you know, rescue efforts as you end up with too many people on an area that doesn't produce enough food, and all of a sudden something goes wrong, and the population's, you know, in a starvation state, and everyone else has to try to at least temporarily help them out. That's due to the fact that much of this area is pretty much, you know, minimal at best for when it comes to planting or agriculture. So your populations in many of these regions are going to be fairly dispersed and very much marginal in terms of the resources they've got available to them. One of the other side points, which is sort of interesting given the, you know, coronavirus issue right now, is the fact that this part of the planet is where, you know, the humans, not only is the human species start, Homo erectus and then Homo sapiens, but also most of our really close relatives are here. I have to remember one of these, probably no reason to notice, but there's a big issue underway in some areas in Central Africa, especially in the Congo, to make sure that COVID-19 doesn't get into the gibbon, chimpanzee, and gorilla populations, because they can catch it. Their genetic code is almost exactly the same as people. So whatever we catch, they catch. Whatever they catch, we can catch. So, you know, this is a period where not only have people been here for millions of years, but anything that wants to sort of predate or use people has been there for incredibly long times. So it's not surprisingly rather sad that what you see is a lot of the diseases that show up in the last, you know, 1,000, 2,000, probably a longer period of time, and get their initial start in this, you know, tropical region of Africa, simply because your viruses and everything have had a longer period of time to adapt and to modify themselves to take advantage of human host. And this is also where in many cases they're going to remodify into new forms and have it start all over again. So let's stop there with that. That's going to keep you guys out of trouble for one.